Are we are we entering a pre-revolutionary era?
Uh, it does appear that way, Glenn. What the oligarchies did traditionally through history is when the social pressures became unbearable, meaning, when the oligarchy completely lost credibility and people wanted to overturn them, then they would cry barbarians at the gate, you know. And so they would project all the problems onto an external enemy, and then they would provide all kinds of incentives or coerce the men of the population, the fighting age males, to go and fight the external enemies. And if they didn't have a war, they would invent one. They would simply contrive one, because what that happened is they would deflect the the grievances onto some external enemy, and then they would send men to war, and then these men would be sacrificed in very large numbers. Uh, and it's controversial to say that that's a deliberate policy, but that's very apparently a deliberate policy, that you send men to war, and then you don't just try to win the war and bring the men home, and now these men are heroes and they're still maybe your potential enemies. You try to get rid of as many as you can, and then you also use the fighting to recruit those who might be your Praetorian Guard, the most compliant, the most ambitious ones who want to serve the power. The problem today is that it doesn't seem that the old playbook is working anymore, because they are losing the control of the narrative. And in the past, they could cry enemies, barbarians at the gates, because they controlled the means of communications, because we all relied on newspapers, magazines, radio, and television. So it was very easy for them to control the narrative, and we didn't have really alternatives. But today we have the internet and the social media. So when they cry barbarians at the gate, that is, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming, uh, people do not believe them, because people have a more discerned understanding of what is happening, and the old tropes that the Russians, when they're done in with Ukraine, that they're going to start invading the rest of Europe. Most people don't feel that way. They don't fear Russia as much as they should. And so when the leading politicians and military leaders tell them, well, guess what, you're going to have to sacrifice your children, people say, no, we don't want to sacrifice our children. We will not. We don't think Russia is our enemy. We should bridge all our differences at a table. And so, the social tensions have become very acute. Our leaders have lost all credibility. The expert class has lost credibility. Standards of living are deteriorating radically. Um, the external enemy, the red cloth of external enemy is not having an effect. So now, what happens now? I think uh, either you get a social uprising, or a revolution, or a civil war. So I think that this is the direction in which we're headed, and hopefully it can be averted. But these people are not just going to go silently into the night. I think that it would be extremely important for us all to try to get as many members of their Praetorian Guards on our side, meaning to try to communicate with people in the military, with the police forces, firefighters, uh, you know, whatever territorial defense units, whatever you have, and to tell them that the enemy is at home, and we need to reform our societies. So let's not, go to war one against the other, but see how we can best reform the our systems, and then the oligarchies will have no choice. That they cannot go against the people.
Well, if you read Plato's Republic, he what to some extent writes what you say now. Though he makes a point that these oligarchy governments, they tend to have a bias towards instability and war. Interestingly, Obama said that when he entered the White House. I talked to Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was there in the White House. He was making the point that Obama told him that in this town, no matter what you try to do, there's always this bias for war. And if you look towards Plato's Republic, this was essentially his argument that the rich elite will begin to accumulate wealth. You would have growing inequality, resentment will begin to spread, and then, of course, the oligarchy would, I guess, lean towards war for two reasons. One, as you said, they also to accrue more wealth, given that they wouldn't carry the cost of these conflicts. It's essentially the peasants who will have to die. But also, starting wars abroad is a good way of uniting the population. It distracts from internal conflicts. It reinforces the power of the elites. Again, it goes back to human nature. We are a group animal. The more the external threat, stronger external threat you have, the more it's in human nature to seek internal cohesion and solidarity. And we will essentially punish each other for failing to toe the line. But is this how, just as a last question, is this how you see many of our current wars? Because we have a lot of problems with the oligarchy. First of all, on the international arena, their power is in decline due to power rise of countries like China, but also the decoupling of energy centers and also great power like Russia, but energy centers like Venezuela, Iran, falling out of control. And you see the hegemon declining. It has the external element of new centers of power, but also domestically, you have more growing resentment from a population. Is this how you see the war against Russia, potentially China, Venezuela, likely in the near future, Iran, and I guess the troubles of our time? Do you see it's linked to the oligarchies?
Yeah, it is linked to the oligarchies, but I think it's not in all cases to deflect from domestic problems. Sometimes they just genuinely want to conquer other nations' resources. That is, they want to gain political control over resource-rich nations. Why? Because in that way, they turn that nation's labor and resources into their own collateral, which is an amazing way to create. It's an amazing way to credit to yourself someone else's wealth, because the moment you've issued loans to your clients, like KBR, ExxonMobil, Shell, whoever, to go and develop an oil resource in Iraq or Iran or wherever, Venezuela, that nation's resource wealth becomes your wealth. The moment you issued that loan to your client. And throughout history, these ruling oligarchies were always the money lending class, including in Rome. So, just as an example, Julius Caesar, who to this day is being demonized in our historical curriculum as the man who almost destroyed Rome's democracy. He actually wanted to reform Rome and curb the power of the oligarchy. Brutus, who was one of the people who assassinated him, was one of those oligarchs. And Brutus wasn't this Republican defender of democracy. He was a rapacious moneylender and a usurer. And there's a story about him extending a loan to the officials of the Cypriot town of Salamis or Salakis, I forget, and charging them 50% or 48% interest. And then when they disagreed, when they said, this is, excessive, we owe you this much and not that much, he sent cavalry to lay siege to the town, and at least 5 city officials died of starvations. But Brutus insisted on payment in full, even though he was charging 48% interest. And this was basically the modus operandi of the Roman Empire, because it was run by the money-lending oligarchies, by the bankers. And so this should be a warning to us, because when Rome fell and it deteriorated in a very ugly way, it was constantly torn apart by civil wars. Roman generals spent more time fighting other Roman generals than barbarians or other invaders. But the way history presents us the Roman Empire and how it all went, they always conceal the most important lessons. They always conceal that it was about debt and banking and oligarchy and colonizations and imperialism and so forth. And so we have to uncover all these lessons now, because we have the internet, because a lot of resources are coming out, and many clever historians endowed with imagination and willingness to dig through the old documents are now publishing extremely interesting books and new interpretations of things that they tried to conceal from us. And so I think in this sense, I feel very, very optimistic about the future. But it's not, again, they're not just going to be going silently into the night. They will put up a fight. They will resist. So we have to stand firm, and we have to demand real changes, not just let's go to war again, and then we're going to start from a blank slate, and then for a generation or two we're going to think that everything is wonderful until the debts become unpayable again, and then we're going to do the whole thing again in cycle after cycle, and sequence more world wars, because we had two, why not have the third one, and then maybe the fourth one, and so forth. So I think we have to break this cycle of history, but the only way we're going to break is by really understanding where the problems are coming from with as much clarity as is possible. And I think that today this is possible. So it's going to take some effort. It's going to take many podcasts like this one, but I think that we have to do it, because that's the future we're going to leave behind to our children and their children.
Well, I like it when we finish on an optimistic note. So so there are changes coming. You do feel not from the newspaper headlines, but obviously you see the shift in sentiment, that there are some who actually want to restore some of the values and virtues which political leaders claim to represent, although clearly abandoned a long time ago. So thank you very much for taking time.
Thank you for the invite, Glenn. Always a pleasure, and until the next time.